In 1990, Dances with Wolves showed us faces that felt timeless. Warriors, elders, and soldiers frozen in history. But time didn't stop when the cameras did. Illness, isolation, forgotten careers, and shocking downfalls followed. By 2026, some are almost unrecognizable. What really happened to them? Stay with us. You won't believe it's the same people. Kevin Costner as Lieutenant John J. Dunbar. Lieutenant John J. Dunbar, the conflicted Union officer in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Kevin Costner. At 35 years old, he carried the role with a calm intensity that anchored the entire film. The character became the moral center of a story about isolation, identity, and belonging. For Costner, Dunbar was not just a performance but a declaration of who he wanted to be as an artist. Kevin Michael Costner, born on January 18, 1955 in Linwood, California, discovered early that success could be as punishing as failure. After the overwhelming triumph of Dances with Wolves, the industry's expectations turned merciless. Each new project was measured against an impossible standard. Films like Wyatt Earp, and especially Waterworld, became lightning rods for criticism, not because they lacked ambition, but because Hollywood had decided ambition itself was his crime. The press labeled him reckless, arrogant, and out of touch. And that narrative clung to him even when box office numbers didn't fully justify the scorn. The strain bled into his physical life. Years of punishing shoots, extensive horseback riding, and long production schedules led to injuries that were rarely discussed publicly. During films like The Postman, which he directed under intense scrutiny, the pressure reportedly pushed him to emotional and physical limits, turning the filmmaking process into an endurance test rather than a creative escape. In the years that followed, Costner refused to retreat quietly. He rebuilt his credibility piece by piece, often in projects far removed from the spotlight that once defined him. Open Range restored critical respect, while later roles such as Hatfield's and McCoy's and The Company Men revealed a darker, more introspective performer. His return to prominence with Yellowstone was not a comeback story of triumph, but one of survival. By 2026, Kevin Costner is still working relentlessly, dividing his time between acting, directing, and developing large-scale Western projects like Horizon and American Saga. His estimated net worth of around $200 million reflects decades of risk, not comfort. What lingers is the shock that one of Hollywood's most successful figures spent so many years fighting to prove he was more than yesterday's headline. Maury McDonnell as Stands with a Fist, the woman torn between cultures in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Maury McDonnell. At 38 years old, she gave the film its quiet, emotional gravity. The role demanded restraint rather than spectacle, and her performance carried grief without explanation. It earned her an Academy Award nomination and briefly suggested Hollywood was ready to embrace her depth. Mary Eileen McDonnell was born on April 28, 1952, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and her struggle was never about talent. It was about timing. After Dances with Wolves and Passion Fish, acclaim did not translate into sustained opportunity. Hollywood narrowed her options brutally, offering fewer leading roles as she aged. She found herself pushed toward characters defined by suffering, authority, or disappearance, even as her skills deepened. Films like Independence Day brought visibility, but not creative control, and frustration quietly accumulated. The emotional toll was compounded by exhaustion rather than illness. Years of stage work, television schedules, and constant reinvention strained her physically, even as she remained outwardly composed. Her ability to endure without spectacle became both her strength and her burden, especially during demanding television runs like Battlestar Galactica. Before 2026, McDonnell carved out a second life on television where complexity still existed. Her portrayal of President Laura Roslin in Battlestar Galactica transformed her into a symbol of moral authority and quiet resilience. Later roles in Major Crimes and The Fall of the House of Usher reaffirmed her relevance, even as Hollywood continued to sideline women of her generation. As of 2026, Mary McDonnell remains active, selective, and deeply respected, continuing to work in television, film, and theater. Her estimated net worth of around $12 million reflects a career built on persistence rather than excess. The shock is not what she achieved, but how often she had to fight simply to be seen, proving that endurance, not applause, defined her legacy. Graham Greene as Kicking Bird. Kicking Bird, the calm moral anchor in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Graham Greene. At 38 years old, he brought dignity, intelligence, and restraint to a role that could easily have been reduced to symbolism. The film's release in 1990 placed him at the center of a global conversation about representation. For many audiences, this was the first time a native character carried wisdom without being silenced or simplified. Born June 22, 1952, in Six Nations Reserve, Ontario, Greene spent decades navigating an industry that applauded him in public while limiting him in private. After his Oscar nomination, opportunity arrived with conditions. Scripts repeated the same narrow expectations: elders, shamans, spiritual guides, roles that required him to constantly negotiate for nuance. Even in major studio films like The Green Mile and Die Hard with a Vengeance, the struggle was never about being seen, but about being respected. That pressure accumulated slowly and painfully. Endless travel, cultural compromise, and the invisible burden of being treated as a spokesperson rather than an individual led to profound exhaustion. As years passed, Greene faced a prolonged, serious illness, one he carried quietly. He continued working when strength allowed, but each role demanded more effort than the last, turning acting into endurance rather than joy. Still, he chose purpose over retreat. He appeared in Wind River, returned to Western storytelling in 1883, and lent his voice to projects that honored Indigenous identity instead of exploiting it. Recognition finally arrived in the form of the Governor General's Performing Arts Award, yet the honor could not erase the decades spent explaining why Native stories deserved depth rather than decoration. Graham Greene passed away on September 1, 2025, at 73 years old, in Stratford, Ontario, after a long battle with illness. His estimated net worth of $1 to $2 million reflected a life devoted to craft and principle rather than wealth. The lasting shock is not how quietly he died, but how much strength he was forced to spend simply existing in an industry that never fully made room for him. Rodney A. Grant as Wind in His Hair, Wind in His Hair. The fierce, unforgettable warrior in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Rodney A. Grant. At 31 years old, his voice, posture, and defiance burned into cinema history. The role brought instant international recognition, yet fame arrived without protection. What followed revealed how fragile success could be when opportunity refused to grow. Born March 9, 1959, in Macy, Nebraska, and a member of the Omaha tribe, Grant entered Hollywood carrying both talent and vulnerability. After Dances with Wolves, casting offers narrowed instead of expanded. He was repeatedly asked to embody warriors, fighters, and silent enforcers, rarely complex men. Films like Geronimo, An American Legend, and Wild Wild West kept him visible, but trapped within the same boundaries. Long periods of unemployment followed, each one reinforcing the sense that his range was being deliberately ignored. The emotional cost ran deeper than career frustration. Abandoned by his biological parents as an infant and raised by his grandparents, Grant carried early wounds long before the industry added new ones. The collision of unresolved trauma, professional stagnation, and racial stereotyping weighed heavily on his mental health. Recognition never translated into security, and self-doubt quietly replaced confidence. As years passed, his priorities shifted from visibility to meaning. He continued acting in smaller projects and television roles, but devoted increasing energy to Native youth advocacy and community leadership. He mentored young Indigenous artists, served on advisory boards, and worked behind the scenes to protect cultural identity rather than personal fame. These choices offered purpose, even as financial stability remained elusive. At 67 years old, Rodney A. Grant remains alive and active, though far from the spotlight that once surrounded him. He continues contributing to independent film and Native community initiatives. His estimated net worth of around $500,000 exposes a painful truth. International recognition does not guarantee lasting support. His story unsettles not because it is rare, but because it is far too common. Wes Studi as Toughest Pawnee. Toughest Pawnee, the brutal, wordless threat in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was played by Wes Studi. At 43 years old, his screen time was brief, yet his presence was unforgettable. The violence and intensity he projected crystallized fear in a single glance. That small role quietly announced a force Hollywood would not be able to ignore. Wesley Studi was born on December 17, 1947, in No Fire Hollow, Oklahoma, a member of the Cherokee Nation, and his path to acting began painfully late. Before film, he was a Cherokee language teacher, a farmer, and a laborer, far removed from Hollywood circles. Entering acting without formal training, he faced skepticism, rejection, and stereotypes that expected Native men to arrive fully formed but never grow. Early opportunities were scarce, and even after Dances with Wolves, the industry tested him with narrow roles in films like The Last of the Mohicans, forcing him to prove intelligence and restraint behind characters written as savagery. The physical and emotional weight of that journey accumulated quietly. Studi carried the strain of a late start, financial instability, and the pressure of redefining Native masculinity on screen. Years of demanding productions, harsh climates, and relentless travel wore on his body. As a result, age and exhaustion became constant companions, especially as he balanced acting with advocacy and cultural responsibility. Instead of retreating, he deepened his purpose. He embraced roles that complicated expectations, from historical figures to leaders burdened by consequence, and later entered global cinema with Avatar, bringing dignity to an entirely fictional world. Recognition finally arrived in 2019 with an Academy Honorary Award, a moment that felt less like celebration and more like delayed justice for decades of resistance and endurance. At 79 years old, Wes Studi remains alive, active, and deeply engaged, continuing to act selectively while dedicating time to Indigenous language preservation and social advocacy. His estimated net worth of around $1 million reflects a life spent prioritizing meaning over money. What shocks is not how much he earned, but how much he carried, quietly, so that others could follow more easily. Tantoo Cardinal as Black Shawl. Black Shawl, the gentle strength beside Kickingbird in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Tantoo Cardinal. At 40 years old, she embodied compassion, endurance, and cultural continuity without a single unnecessary gesture. Her performance grounded the film emotionally, even as attention drifted elsewhere. It was a role that resonated deeply, yet offered little protection from what followed. Tantoo Cardinal was born on July 20, 1950, in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and her life began in hardship. Raised in poverty and losing her mother early, she entered adulthood carrying grief that never fully loosened its grip. Hollywood mirrored that struggle, offering her supporting roles shaped by silence and sacrifice. Films like Legends of the Fall gave her visibility, but rarely agency, reinforcing an industry pattern that valued her presence while minimizing her voice. The emotional toll was relentless. Cardinal navigated discrimination rooted in both gender and race, often expected to endure quietly while raising children under financial strain. Personal loss, family responsibility, and professional marginalization intersected, leaving little room for rest. There were no public breakdowns, only persistence through exhaustion. Grief folded neatly behind professionalism. Rather than surrender, she turned resistance into action. She became outspoken about representation, fought for Indigenous women to be portrayed as complex and alive, and continued working in projects that mattered, from television to stage. Her later career included powerful appearances in Longmire and a return to global attention with Killers of the Flower Moon, roles shaped by lived experience rather than stereotype. At 76 years old, Tantoo Cardinal remains alive, acting and advocating with undiminished resolve. She continues to speak, protest, and perform, even when the cost is personal. Her estimated net worth of around $1 million stands in stark contrast to her cultural impact. Floyd Red Crow Westerman as 10 Bears. 10 Bears, the dignified Comanche leader in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Floyd Red Crow Westerman. At 54 years old, his voice carried centuries of loss, patience, and unbroken resolve. The role was brief but commanding, rooted more in presence than dialogue. For many viewers, 10 Bears felt more like a living memory. Floyd Red Crow Westerman was born on August 17, 1936, on the Lake Traverse Reservation in South Dakota, a member of the Sisseton Dakota people. Long before acting, his life was shaped by trauma inflicted through U.S. boarding schools, where his hair was cut, his language forbidden, and his identity disciplined out of him. Those early wounds never healed quietly. They became the fuel for a lifelong struggle to reclaim culture, dignity, and voice in a country determined to erase both. Music became his first battlefield. As a country singer and songwriter, Westerman used albums like Custer Died for Your Sins to confront colonial violence and historical lies. The work brought admiration, but also isolation. He was too political for mainstream success, too outspoken to be comfortably celebrated. When he later entered film, Hollywood again narrowed him into elders and chiefs, roles that echoed respect while limiting range, forcing him to speak truth through constraint. His health deteriorated slowly, overshadowed by decades of activism, touring, and emotional labor. Leukemia arrived not as a headline, but as a long, grinding battle. Even while ill, Westerman continued appearing in projects such as The X-Files, Walker, Texas Ranger, and Hidalgo, determined to remain visible and useful. Acting was never an escape. It was another form of testimony. Floyd Red Crow Westerman passed away on December 13, 2007, at 71 years old, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles from complications related to leukemia. His estimated net worth of around $500,000 reflected a life devoted to activism, not accumulation. What remains is the ache of knowing that a man who spent his life protecting culture was forced to fight so hard simply to exist within it. Nathan Lee. Chasing his horse as Smiles a Lot. Smiles a Lot, the wide-eyed Lakota boy in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Nathan Lee chasing his horse. At just 14 years old, his performance radiated innocence and warmth, embodying the promise of a generation not yet scarred. The role etched his face into cinematic history. Few could have imagined how sharply that promise would later collapse. Nathan Lee. Chasing His Horse was born on April 28, 1976, in South Dakota, a member of the Sikangu Lakota. Fame arrived early and without guidance. As he aged, acting opportunities faded, and he drifted away from film towards spiritual leadership, presenting himself as a traditional healer. What began as cultural engagement slowly transformed into unchecked authority, built on devotion rather than accountability. The unraveling was devastating. In 2023, Chasing His Horse was arrested following a multi-state investigation involving allegations of sexual abuse, trafficking, and coercion, many involving underage native girls. Authorities described him as the leader of a hidden cult operating under the guise of traditional medicine. Evidence spanned decades, exposing manipulation, fear, and silence within vulnerable communities that had once trusted him. The scandal erased everything that came before it. His public identity shifted overnight, from former child actor to accused abuser. Projects like Into the West became footnotes in a story dominated by courtrooms, raids, and testimony. His daughter, model Quanah Chasinghorse, publicly distanced herself, underscoring the personal wreckage left behind. At 50 years old, Nathan Lee chasing his horse remains alive, but his life is defined by ongoing legal battles and incarceration, rather than creativity. His estimated net worth of $100,000 or less reflects total collapse, financial, reputational, and moral. What shocks most is not the fall itself, but how a symbol of innocence became a warning of unchecked power. Maury Chaykin as Major Fambro. Major Fambro, the unraveling army officer in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Maury Chaykin. At 41 years old, he turned a small role into a chilling portrait of isolation and madness. The character's sudden collapse felt uncomfortably real. It lingered because Chaykin understood how fragile authority can be when the mind gives way. Maury Allen Chaykin was born on July 27, 1949, in Brooklyn, New York, and spent his career being unforgettable without ever being safe. Casting directors loved his face, distinct, heavy with implication, but rarely trusted him with comfort. He became Hollywood's specialist in anxiety, excess, and menace, moving from one eccentric supporting role to another in films like My Cousin Vinny and Devil in a Blue Dress. The work was constant, yet stability never followed, and the pressure to keep delivering intensity became exhausting. His health mirrored that instability. Chaykin's weight fluctuated dramatically over the years, and chronic medical issues followed him quietly from set to set. Fatigue was constant, stress unrelenting. While playing brilliant but troubled figures, most notably Nero Wolfe, he was managing a body that increasingly resisted the pace of his own career, a private battle that rarely paused production. He continued working relentlessly, even as his health worsened. Performances in a Nero Wolfe mystery, The Sweet Hereafter, and later Less Than Kind, showed a man sharpening his craft rather than retreating from it. Colleagues spoke of his generosity and fearlessness, yet the strain was visible. The roles grew heavier, and so did the cost of carrying them. Maury Chaykin died on July 27, 2010, his 61st birthday, in Toronto, from complications related to a heart valve infection. His estimated net worth of around $1 million reflected steady work, not security. The shock remains that a man so alive on screen spent his final years fighting a body that would not keep pace with his mind. Robert Pastorelli, as Timmons, the volatile civilian presence in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Robert Pastorelli. At 36 years old, he brought rawness and unpredictability to the screen. The performance hinted at danger just beneath the surface. It felt lived in, because it was. Robert Joseph Pastorelli was born on June 21, 1954, in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and his life was shaped early by pain. A near-fatal car accident ended his dream of becoming a professional boxer and introduced him to narcotics at a young age. Acting became both salvation and escape. His breakthrough on Murphy Brown made him recognizable, beloved even, but fame did not quiet the demons that followed him from project to project. Addiction never fully released its grip. Periods of sobriety were followed by relapse, each one chipping away at trust and momentum. The industry noticed the instability, even as Pastorelli delivered fearless work in projects like Sister Act 2 and Striking Distance. The tension between talent and self-destruction defined his career, turning every success into a fragile pause rather than a turning point. The breaking point came in 1999, when his girlfriend Herman died from a gunshot wound in his home. Though authorities ruled the death undetermined and Pastorelli was not charged, the trauma shattered him. Hollywood quietly pulled away. Roles dwindled, grief deepened addiction, and isolation replaced the camaraderie that once sustained him. Robert Pastorelli was found dead on March 8, 2004, at 49 years old, in his Hollywood Hills home, the result of a heroin overdose. His estimated net worth of around $1 million stood in painful contrast to the cost of his struggle. He was laid to rest at St. Catherine's Cemetery in Seagirt, New Jersey. What remains is a devastating reminder that talent can survive almost anything, except silence around pain. Jimmy Herman as Stone Calf. Stone Calf, the quiet Sioux warrior in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Jimmy Herman. At 50 years old, his presence carried weight far beyond dialogue. The role was small, but it felt lived in, grounded, and real. He looked like someone who had been there long before the camera arrived. Jimmy Herman was born on October 25, 1940, on the Cold Lake Reserve in Alberta, Canada, into a Chippewayan and Dene lineage shaped by community responsibility rather than performance. Acting came late, only after years spent in indigenous media, counseling services, and advocacy. Leaving stable work to pursue film meant financial risk and cultural exposure, especially at a time when indigenous actors were rarely trusted with meaningful visibility. The struggle was not about fame, but about representation. Herman carried the pressure of knowing that each appearance might be one of the few chances audiences had to see indigenous people portrayed with dignity. Even after Dances with Wolves, most opportunities remained secondary. Extras, supporting roles, characters at the margins. Series like North of 60 and appearances in films such as Unforgiven offered work, but never security. Age and physical strain became constant companions. Long shoots, travel between Canada and the U.S., and years of balancing activism with performance took their toll. The quiet wear of a body that had given more than it had taken, and a heart that eventually could not keep pace. Jimmy Herman passed away on September 13, 2013, at 72 years old, in Edmonton, Alberta, reportedly from a heart attack. He was laid to rest in the Cold Lake First Nations Community Cemetery, returning to the land that shaped him. His estimated net worth of around $500,000 reflected a life of service rather than accumulation. The sadness lingers in how gently he moved through history, leaving impact without ever being fully seen. Doris leader, charge as Pretty Shield. Pretty Shield, the elder woman in Dances with Wolves, 1990, was portrayed by Doris Leader Charge. At 60 years old, she did more than act. She carried language, memory, and truth onto the screen. Her presence felt ancestral, as if the film briefly stepped aside to let history speak. Few performances have ever felt so necessary. Doris Leader Charge was born on May 4, 1930, on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, and her life was marked early by loss. Widowed young after her husband died in a car accident, she raised children alone while working as a nurse's aide, cook, and waitress. Education came late and hard-won, achieved only after decades of survival labor that left little room for dreams. Her true life's work was language. For 28 years, she taught Lakota language and culture, fighting a quiet war against erasure. When Dances with Wolves arrived, she became the film's linguistic backbone, coaching actors, translating dialogue, and insisting on authenticity. Acting was never her goal. Preservation was. The role of Pretty Shield emerged naturally from that mission, not ambition. The work was exhausting but purposeful. She toured nationally, spoke publicly about representation, and stood on the Oscar stage translating a Best Adapted Screenplay acceptance speech into Lakota. Health declined in later years, but she continued teaching and advocating as long as strength allowed. Doris Leader Charge passed away on February 20th, 2001, at 70 years old. Her burial at Black Hills National Cemetery placed her among those she honored through language and memory. Her estimated net worth of around $100,000 stood in stark contrast to the cultural wealth she preserved. The heartbreak lies in knowing that someone who gave so much to history lived so quietly within it. Time changed every face you just saw. Some slowly, some brutally, some in ways no one could have predicted. Behind the beauty of Dances with Wolves lies a legacy of survival, loss, and unfinished stories that still echo today. Which transformation shocked you the most? And whose story stayed with you after the screen went dark? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold cast stories like this, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next.